problem. We got to figure this out.
Yeah, there's going to be a big class factor right through the education system as well. People who, kids who are getting access to decent online stuff and kids who are not. It's going to be a massive separation.
Yeah.
Because start the music.
I don't know, who was that?
Adam, I enjoyed your book on the suspended revolution immensely. It was very interesting thinking about Zimbabwe.
Thank you.
liberté.
Greetings to all of you who have joined us on the Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue Forum. All of you from across the world, but especially at home here in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, on the continent, and various parts of the world. Today's policy dialogue is a special one. Special one because it's unusual. As unusual as it is, because we are responding to a recent crisis in South Africa, which offers us the opportunity to bring together among the best minds that we have in South Africa, even if they're dispersed as they are. Some out there in Europe, people like Adam and Tabi, but nevertheless engaged with home, thanks to social media, thanks to this technology, Zoom. Today we're looking at South Africa, acknowledging the failures, exploring the trajectory towards a better political and economic future. I won't go into details of it. In terms, there's a concept note before you, and the long one, which is available. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our panel and discussants and start straight away. First is Adam Habib, Professor Adam Habib, South African, an academic, activist, a public intellectual, director of SOAS, University of London, but previously VC and principal of University of the Wits in South Africa. Prominent political scientist, about whom we are very proud. Co-founder of the African Research Universities Alliance. He has published in numerous books, and among the most prominent, which obviously has qualified him, among other things, for this task this evening, is his book, South Africa's Suspended Revolution, 2013, Hopes and Prospects. And another one, 2019, Rebels and Rage, reflecting on Fees Must Fall. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
Out there in London.
Thank you.
Our next, after Adam will come a young lady, Tabi Lioka, an economist who runs her own economic consulting company, Naha Investments. Significantly, Tabi was appointed to the Presidential Economic Advisory Council in 2019. She sits on the Statistics South Africa Council, where she chairs the Economic Committee. She was appointed by the Minister of Finance in 2018 to review the zero-rated products in order to support the poor and vulnerable in the country. Welcome, Tabi. I met Tabi some years ago in Harare. She's somewhere in Europe at the moment, huh? But safe. Our third panelist is Ms. Bisi Deltiana, an associate professor in political politics at the University of Joburg in South Africa. Holds a PhD in political science from the University of the Wits. He has held research positions at various institutions, including the Center for Policy Studies, the Steve Biko Foundation, and the Human Sciences Research Council. His research and writing is on African intellectuals, African nationalism, identity, and electoral politics. Sibisi writes regularly for newspapers and provides political analysis on electronic media. He's an accomplished public intellectual. Our third discussant is Dr. Pali Lehola. He's joining us late. He's at another assignment. He's the former Assistant General of South Africa, a position he held for almost 20 years. He is the founding chair of the Statistics Commission of Africa and chairs the African Symposium on Statistical Development. He has so many honors, too many to mention, and several honorary doctorates from Stellenbosch, from KwaZulu-Natal, University of Joburg, where he's professor of practice, and so on and so forth. And then we have Nomboniso Gasa, adjunct professor at School of Public Law at University of Cape. She's senior research associate at UCT. Her work focused on land, politics, gender, and cultural issues. Professor Gasa has a long history of political and women's rights activism extending before the dawn of democracy in South Africa. Have been detained at the tender age of 14 in the former Transkei. Long time in the trenches of Nomboniso. Welcome, Nomboniso. I don't see her there, but I saw on the roster. Then my brother Vasu Gounden will be joining us late too, founder and executive director of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, which he founded in 1992. Vasu is currently involved in the Sudan peace process. He has served on several commissions in South Africa and serves on the boards of several institutions across the world, including the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum. Right now, he is involved in Durban, dealing with the recent crisis. So if he's late, please forgive him, he's busy. Then another brother of mine, Professor Seth Cooper, one who I know from the heady days of the early 70s when we were colleagues and comrades in the Black Consciousness movement, with me on this side of the border, and he and Steve Biko, and others like Bani Pityana, Hernan Ngukulu, down there. And Seth has been a long time in the trenches, Robben Island, detention here and there, but here he looks strong still. Strong, growing up in the struggle. Well, welcome, Seth. Welcome, nice to have you. Last but not least, my brother Eddie Maloka, Professor Eddie Maloka. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism and adjunct professor at the University of Wits School of Governance. He's previously special advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, and South Africa's special representative to the Great Lakes region, and special advisor to the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa. He's been an advisor on governance issues, NEPAD. He's a truly African academic and diplomat. Welcome to you all. So without much ado, ask Adam, please, get us going.
Yep. Thanks, Ibo. Colleagues, it's lovely meeting you. I'm sad that I'm doing it from afar, but it's really a wonderful opportunity to reflect on this. I am mindful that I'm speaking from afar, and I'm mindful that I'm not on the ground. And so in the initial days of the protests and, if you like, the food revolts, I refrained from making any comments. I tried to do a lot of reading. I spoke to lots of colleagues on the ground, and I basically let those in South Africa make the series of reflections that needed to be done. And then, if you like, I did a intervention in the Daily Maverick that reflected back on what colleagues were thinking about, what they were saying, and tried to think through what this means for the developmental issues and the challenges that face South Africa. And that's what I'm going to speak of, it seems to me. I want to kick off by saying that this represents the most significant challenge to the post-apartheid state since 1994. It does depend on how we see this, these protests and what form they will take. Were they simply a food revolt by the poor, who many of whom are really struggling to live under the challenging conditions we find ourselves? Or was it an attempt by some factions within the ANC and outside of it to foment a rebellion, and in the process that rebellion went viral? Those are two very distinct analyses. Now, of course, there's an overlap between the two. But if we see it simply as a food revolt, then our course of action has to be a slightly different one. If we see it as an attempted rebellion by some actors within the ANC and outside, and that went subsequently viral and culminated in a food revolt, then our action has to be slightly different. And I want to put that squarely on the agenda as part of my introductory remarks. I think it's important to think through this and then reflect our potential solutions on the basis of that. So that's the first substantive remark that I was quite keen on highlighting in this context. If we are going to resolve and address this challenge, it seems to me that we have to address it at three levels, one of which we speak about a lot of, inequality. Mainly progressives tend to raise the issue of inequality and the fact that we needed to address inequality. I think this is broadly correct. Second, more conservative elements and those who are in the security apparatus sometimes speak of security independently of inequality. They see this as a security problem. And that's the kind of lens that one begins to understand it. My argument is in this piece has been that we actually got to see it at three levels. Yeah, any developmental enterprise, any attempt to address the challenge we in has to be constructed on a tripartite agenda. The first is addressing inequality. The second is addressing security and what I call political stability. And the third is addressing state capacity. If you are looking on addressing inequality, and I'm sure that other colleagues are more trained to speak about this, Tabi would probably speak about this in much greater detail, we have to do it at two levels. One, at the level of policy, and the second at the level of behavior. At the level of policy, we have to be comfortable and politically committed to addressing the increasing inequality in the Gini coefficient, the expanding, the increase in the Gini coefficient. That needs to be our focus, as opposed to other priorities, which is simply creating a new generation of entrepreneurs, etc. As much as that is important, and I'm not arguing against it, it seems to me that the singular focus of our policy agenda should be to drive down the Gini coefficient. And frankly, in the post-apartheid era, we've tried to do other things that has driven the Gini coefficient up in quite a big way. And so we need to resolve that policy challenge. The second policy challenge that we need to deal with is you can't bring down the Gini coefficient in sufficient scale unless you drive employment. And if you're going to drive employment, you're going to have to grapple with the tension between employment and driving employment up, and some of the problems and tensions with the unions who are intent on keeping salaries and other things structured in a particular format. And so you need to resolve the policy tensions that exist in the ruling party and in government itself. The second way to deal with inequality seems to be behavior. And in that, you're going to have to marshal the private sector, but I would argue not only the private sector, but also civil society and the unions to start singing from the same hymn sheet. You need to drive the private sector in a way that allows it to make profit, but allows it to also become responsive to national developmental agendas and to start being responsive to what we need to do. So you need to steward that. And in a sense, both resolving the economic policy tensions and marshalling behavior, whether it's the private sector, whether it's civil society, was fundamental to understanding the developmental experiences of Southeast Asia. And often we don't sufficiently talk about that. But what also the Southeast Asian developmental experience brings to the fore is if you want to have an economic agenda that addresses inequality, you've got to have two other things. One is security and stability. If you don't have security and stability, you can't increase investment in productive enterprises. And you can't bring that, you can't then drive the kinds of economic growths and the employments that you are meant to achieve. Now, if you're going to do that in Southeast Asia, they did it under authoritarian systems, but there are experiences in other parts of the world where security was established under more democratic systems. But it seems to me that you have to take security seriously. And the problem with South African progressives too often is we don't want to debate security, and we are complacent about the violence that is implicit in protests. Almost all of our strikes are violent. Almost all of our civic protests are violent. And some of it has to do with the nature of our policing, and we need to address that. But there is a tendency that we become complacent about violence. And so long as we are complacent about violence, we don't take security seriously, and you don't create the second dynamic that is important for addressing inequality. And then the third element is what I call state capacity or state capabilities. Again, the development experience is quite clear. You can't imagine a development experience that marshals the private sector to behave in particular ways or civil society to behave in particular ways without having a state that is capable of doing that. And when you need a state that is capable of doing that, you need people who are sufficiently and appropriately qualified. And frankly, we're lying to ourselves if we say that we take qualifications seriously in appointments to the state. I can tell you this from personal experience, how often I've had to debate colleagues about qualification. Now, it's true that meritocracy is racially encoded in South Africa. But the answer to a racially encoded meritocracy is not to say we don't need merit at all. It's to de-racialize, is to establish indicators that are not racialized indicators. It's not to deny the importance of qualifications, as has happened in many, many institutions in the state. I mean, there was an analysis done a couple of years ago that most CFOs at local government level can't read a balance sheet. That's a crazy situation to be. How do you expect them to manage the developmental state at the local level? So stability and state capacity needs to be taken seriously. What does this all mean? Well, one of the things in the developmental enterprise that we need to think through is how you sequence these three tripartite elements. You can't get the inequality issues addressed in the investment that is required without addressing the security issues. And you can't get the inequality and marshalling of the state, of the private sector and the unions and civil society without some level of state capacity. So you have to take all of these elements quite seriously. And frankly, there are enough evidence, empirical evidence in the South African context for the last 5 years, 10 years, it's become worse. But prior to that, where we didn't take security, state capacity, and economic policy, resolving the economic conundrums seriously. And so that's what my piece in the Daily Maverick said. Let me give you two pragmatic reasons why I think we need to start taking security seriously. And I provocatively put in the Daily Maverick article that I believe that at least we required in the early days a state of emergency, a partial state of emergency in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. And that flowed out of my understanding of what actually happened. If we see these revolts as having been in part fermented, a fermented rebellion by elements within the ANC and outside that went viral, then you can almost be committed, you can almost be guaranteed that those actors are going to would do it again. And if there isn't, if you like, the attempt to contain them, to hold them accountable, then we will be back here. Just bear in mind that actually in Mooi River, for the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, we've had people burning down truckers in the Mooi River Plaza, a kind of low intensity sabotage of our logistics framework. And we haven't acted seriously about this as a state, repeatedly. And it seems to me that we need to take this seriously. And if you're going to do that, we're going to have to act there. One of the things that is quite striking is many of those who fermented the rebellion not only did so, they did it through parallel structures, new business organizations, new civic entities, and they used those entities to start fermenting the politics that played out, that ultimately played out in the revolt that place. So you can't not actually act, and it seems to me that security, a much more substantive security agenda, has to be taken seriously. Only then can you stabilize the situation to follow through on the issues around addressing and marshalling the private sector, the unions, the policy agendas, and the state capacity issues that you need. The second reason why you need this done is at this moment, large parts of civil society have lost faith in the state in providing what is the foundational pact of any state. I give up my right to bear arms in exchange for the state giving me security, and I obey the monopoly on violence. That has been abandoned because effectively large parts of actors in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng have taken the security into their own hands through neighborhood security mechanisms. Now, I'm particularly terrified of that because it seems to me that it's really dangerous to decentralize security to neighborhood committees and to particularly centralize it to privatize neighborhood security committees. Because in effect, this takes a racial form in many parts of our country and is a recipe for a racial conflagration at some point. It's not acceptable under any conditions, but it becomes even more so in a racially explosive society like ours. And so I think it's a really dangerous thing to allow, and therefore the state needs to reassert its security. Of course, we need capacities. We need to develop the state's capacities to act in appropriate ways. But we cannot have a situation where the state abrogates its responsibility to take seriously the security of its citizens. Otherwise, you're going to see more and more conflagrations as is appearing in Phoenix and in parts of Durban. And I think that that's a dangerous thing to allow. And so my argument is effectively, if we're serious about a sustainable solution, we got to recognize it's going to be addressing inequality, it's addressing state capacity, and it's addressing security. And frankly, in the short term, we have to start taking seriously securing citizens' safety, taking seriously the security dimension, both to contain the actors who fermented the rebellion in the first place, but also to make sure that we don't allow privatized security arrangements to emerge in neighborhoods, because that runs the risk of even further racial conflagrations. And so that's where I would stop, Ivo, as my first set of ideas around how I think we need to think this through. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks very much for outlining the tripartite, as you call it. Just now, two questions I have. Is this issue of, I think, the three, inequality, addressing inequality, addressing security, addressing state capacity, really describes the requirements for developmental state. No doubt about that. And my first question is whether you think the security issue is as serious as painted today in Daily Maverick by one Oscar Van Heiden. I don't know if you read that article. Are things as bad as that, where he's arguing that state security or the National Security Agency has virtually collapsed. That's his argument. Is it as bad as that, in your view?
So my view, and I'm looking, so look, between you and me, there's three fundamental challenges on the security dimension. I think it's very, very serious. And I think we are being complacent if we don't take it seriously enough. I think partly the security agencies are divided. They're divided because the party is factionalized, and the factionalization of the party has manifested in the security apparatus itself. So that's the first. The second is, it doesn't matter whether, I suspect that they did know. But even if they didn't know, this is either incompetence or complicity. And both of those are fundamentally dangerous to the democratic state. Because this should have been, they should have known. And if they didn't know, they should have the capacity to act very quickly to stop the spread of the violence that happened. And either way, that wasn't there. And then the third is actually, this isn't new. Every single protest has over the last 5-7 years has been violent. It hasn't reached the scale of this violence, but it's been violent. You know, it's not the first time that we've had trucks burnt in the Moirova complex. This is the 5th or 6th time in as many years where this has happened. So clearly, and there are all kinds of reports about Umkhonto and other elements being involved in this thing. Actors associated with the ruling party are involved. I think we got to take this far more seriously than it is. So that's why people do raise the issue of the Bill of Rights. And I think that that's something we should be worried about. But that's why I think it's not a permanent state of emergency. And second, it's a partial one. But I do think we got to take security seriously. And I think one of the things that a state of emergency does that way, it really cuts through the party and actually makes very clear that the line authority is to the commander-in-chief. And that, I think, is important when you got a divided security apparatus. And more importantly, you got a divided party.
Yes, we'll come back to this, especially the issue of the state capacity. But before I turn to Tabi to look at the problem of inequality, poverty, unemployment specifically, just one word, Adam. How do we address the problem of state capacity, which from all accounts, people reflecting on the events of earlier this month in the newspapers, the people like Bani Tomboti, people like William Gumede, and I no doubt Mr. Bisi will be touching on it. There is evidence of a state capacity problem. How do we begin addressing that? What would be your recommendation, briefly?
Yeah, so I think that, by the way, the state capacity problem, I think you're right. What these protests brought to the fore is the state's incapacity in the security services. Intelligence has collapsed, ability to act has collapsed, etc. And by the way, we've seen this multiple times over the years. My own view is we're going to have appropriately qualified people to be able to play the role. We have to start appointing more appropriate people with skill sets, appropriate skill sets, with appropriate training, with appropriate development. And frankly, in the police service and actually in the defense force, you need people that meet certain fitness levels to achieve the purposes that they need. And frankly, in all of these things, we abrogate these rules, which would never, I mean, just look at the age categories of the South African Defense Force. And then appropriate defense forces in other parts of the world that are highly competent. And you'll see just age categories and all of that, they are quite striking features. The second is I do think that there are capacities. And this is what's the interesting thing about the South Africa. South Africa has certain capacities within its institutions, but they don't enable them. There are certain capacities within the private sector that we need to look at. So I would think in the short term, you need new appointments, particularly at the levels of leadership. You need to shift some people out. You need to bring other people in. You need to borrow some capacity from the private sector. And in the medium term, you need to start getting new types of people appointed with new skill sets, new training arms, etc. But in the short term, this is the great thing about South Africa. We do have capacities. The problem is they become privatized. They're sitting in the private sector. You need to marshal them, put them on the state management processes. And you need leadership for that. People who are committed to that agenda in the short term. And then we're looking at a training arm in the medium term.
Thanks, Adam. Tabi, Lioka, please.
Thanks, Ibo, and thanks, Adam, for that very, very interesting and I think you captured our problems very well. I'm just going to now talk about the economic problems that we find ourselves in, and I'm going to try to answer some of the reasons why we are in this predicament. I'm going to start with our GDP, the structure of the economy, and then I'm going to look at employment and the fiscus, and then hopefully we'll leave the rest to the Q&A session. So if you look at, South Africa's economy has not been growing very well, especially if you look at the past 10 years. We've really barely, grown by 2%. And this talks to employment as well, which I'll speak to later. And hopefully I see that that Lehosh has also joined in, and he will also give us a picture of the South African economy and also throw in a few statistics as the former statistician general. And so if you look at, as I was saying, if you look at the South African economy, it hasn't been growing, especially in the past 10 years. And I actually blame the structure of the South African economy for that. If you look at the composition of the South African economy, it's actually very well balanced. We're not heavily weighted on mining or retail or whatever sector of manufacturing. But what has been worrying is a development that has happened in the recent 3-4 years, and that is that the sector that has been growing the most has been the finance sector. Now, the finance sector is a sector that doesn't employ a lot of people. It's very low labor intensive, and it's not tradable. And the sector that actually should be, growing fast, sectors that should be growing fast are the manufacturing sector, agriculture, and mining. And I'll add tourism there. And these are because these are tradable sectors. We get a lot of trade. We should, receive a lot of trade revenues from them. They're high labor intensive, so they absorb a lot of workers' employment, and they don't require high skilled labor, just like with finance. And unfortunately, these sectors, especially the manufacturing sector, over the years, it's been shrinking rather than expanding. So fewer and fewer people are working in the or part of the manufacturing sector. So again, so this is part of the structural rigidities that we're seeing in the South African economy. When we now look at employment, I always ask people, it's unfortunate that we are doing this virtually, but it would be very interesting to see what cars people in this participants like. But let's just choose a Ferrari. The South African economy is like a Ferrari with an engine of an Uno. I don't know if many of you remember the Uno, the small car. And you can't then accelerate. You can't grow fast if your unemployment, if you've got such high unemployment rate. And that's how I'd characterize the South African economy. Very beautiful aesthetically, but at the same time we don't achieve that takeoff growth that we want to see because of the very high unemployment rate. Now, if you look at the unemployment figures, the South African economy, if you look at if you consider the discouraged workers, the unemployment rate, it's closer to about 40%. And if you look at what is worrying is the youth unemployment rate, which is above 70% if you look at the broader definition of employment. And this is also, a huge burden on the South African growth path and growth trajectory, why we're not growing. Graduate unemployment rate is also very high at around, and these are ages between 15 and 24. These are averaging around, 40%. These are very high numbers. And what is very startling with the recent numbers from Stats SA is that graduate unemployment, so those with university degrees, that figure is 9.3%. And a few years ago, that figure was 2.3% when we were worried that our graduates aren't getting employed. Again, if you look at the not in employment, education and training, what we call the NEETs, between the ages of 15 and 24, about 10.2 million people between those age groups are not in employment, education and training. So again, when we go back to our sectors, the sectors are not employing, they're not absorbing labor. But then let's also look at the education system. I know that Professor Habib mentioned education slightly, and as someone who actually has 5 degrees, 3 from Wits University, I have a different view about education in South Africa. If I look at other countries such as the Scandinavian countries and also Switzerland, which I think gives us a great barometer. In Switzerland, 30% of the Swiss have university degrees, 70% go through apprenticeship. They get employed in blue chip companies, those who've been through apprenticeship. And I think the difference here is that in a country like Switzerland, the university degree, the high school, the matriculate, the matric certificate is a matriculant is well trained versus our matriculants, which I think that do not have the equivalent training. So from that matric certificate, it's easy for someone to then be absorbed into labor through apprenticeship, or they can start their own business and become entrepreneurs. And that's because the education that they received at high school level equips them to understand a balance sheet, to understand basic accounting, to conduct a business, which our matric degree or the education that we receive, it does not equip a matriculant with those very key essentials for running a business, for either being an entrepreneur or also going through an apprenticeship system. And so I think that is also a really big problem when you look at why are South Africans so highly, the unemployment rate is high and the structure of the economy is balanced. At the same time, it's not absorbing labor, but also what is going on within our education system. And partly, I want to emphasize that the fact that, or the reason why we have this poor education outcomes is historical, but we don't seem to overcome the historical burden. And I think that if we also look at ways in which we can overcome these historical burdens, it will go a long way into also shrinking this unemployment rate. The other problem which I'm seeing in South Africa currently is that there's actually really only one pipeline between high school and employment, and that is university, getting that tertiary education. And if you look at other systems elsewhere, we did away with the technicons, but there should be multiple layers and various pipelines of getting employment besides the university degree. The TVET college are not very successful currently. and many of those who went through the TVET system are not employed, which is also worrying. And we tend to, even when the system doesn't work, we still continue with it until 10 years or 20 years of complete failure. And so I think that we need to review the TVET system. I would strongly recommend that we introduce the technical system and various other systems that bridge between employment and that matric certificate, high school level education. So that is the problem with the employment and labor absorption and youth employment that we're seeing. We've tried various ways. I think there's the YES program. And I don't think that these programs are working efficiently. I think that we're not talking enough about education and education reform, and we're not talking enough about, and not doing enough in terms of getting corporate South Africa to absorb a lot of these of either matriculants and train them, and also absorb graduates. The other problem that we have in South Africa, so I was part of the, I contributed towards the free education report, I think it was called the HIHA Commission. And I was part of that commission where I investigated ways in which to fund free education. And in that report, it was very clear that we, as a country, we cannot afford free education. And this moves me to the fiscus. We are fiscally constrained. As much as, yes, we tend to talk about South Africa as a wealthy country, the way we allocate our resources is insufficient. It makes it very inefficient because allocating our resources towards consumption-based areas of the fiscus rather than an investment based. So even as we are speaking today, the burden of free education is heavy on the fiscus. And I think that we recommended various ways of overcoming this, and it still hasn't. And obviously the former president announced recklessly, I must say, without reading the full report, announced that we should have free education. And even though we recommended various ways to overcome that. So in a fiscally constrained country, the other burden on the fiscus is social grants. And, I always say a measure of a successful social grant system is the way in which the recipients are, there are less and less people who are reliant on the social grants. And I think politically what we've seen is the more people who are reliant on the social grant system has become a measure of the success of the social grant system. Currently, KwaZulu-Natal, and this also relates to what happened recently, KwaZulu-Natal has about 4 million people. It has the highest number of social grant recipients, standing at 4 million. The second highest is Gauteng at 2.9 million. And then the third is Eastern Cape at 2.8 million. And so if you look at where we were in 2006, there were only 3 million recipients of social grants in 1996, 3 million recipients of social grants. In 2000, there were 9 million. In 2003, there were 14 million. Where we see a big jump is between 2004 and 2010, where 2004 we had about 20% of recipients, and then at 2010 we had 14 million, so 30% of our population reliant on social grants, which was 14 million people in 2010. That's the big leap between 3 million in 1996 and 14 million in 2010. And so this also speaks to policy failure, that in all this time, we were unable to solve the triple challenge of unemployment and poverty and inequality And what we saw is the opposite happening, that more and more people fell within this, dependency on the social grants. As we speak now, there are about 18 million South Africans that are reliant on social grants, compared to 3 million in 1996. And that is about 31% of the population. And then last year, which was, a very difficult year for the economy. We were in a recession before the pandemic, and we went into a very deep and very strict lockdown, which resulted in many people losing their jobs and being reliant on the increasingly so on the social grant program. And last year we had 61% of South Africans relying on some form of social assistance. And that is, again, a significant number of people relying on the social grants. So again, when you go back to growing the economy and going to my example of choosing a Ferrari with an engine of an Uno, it is very difficult for South Africa to reach this, to see accelerated growth when a huge proportion of the population is unemployed and increasingly reliant or relying on the social grant program. It is also very difficult for us to get out of this economic rut without policies that are very targeted at the bottom. So we need to see bottom up policies that are targeted at the very poor, at the vulnerable, at the marginalized, in order for us to start growing the economy. And I think that the previous policies were very top down and didn't quite reach the poorest of the poor, who are now actually in the majority if we consider that over 50% of South Africans live in poverty. So there is a policy failure. There is a lack of, I think, an understanding of what the urgency of this problem. And when we saw I'll call it, an insurrection, because that's what I believe it is. I do not believe that the poor would intentionally be that disruptive. There have been, every year in South Africa, we have social service delivery protests. And that's because, especially in the peripheral, outside of the urban areas, in some years we've had over 1,000 service delivery protests where poor people have been protesting on the lack of electricity, lack of water, road infrastructure, etc. And never have they been as disruptive as we saw in 2 weeks ago. So I think that it is unfair to then blame it what happened on the poor. We have had an increasing number of poor people, and we haven't seen that kind of disruption. Secondly, we've seen infrastructure such as the ports and water purification centers and the telecommunication lines, etc., being demolished, burnt, etc. And that is not in the interest of the poor people to do so. Poor people opportunistically looted, but it is the insurrection was not started by poor people. But there is a danger with having huge unemployment, huge social unrest, neglecting people who are poor, who are vulnerable, not having policies that are targeted at uplifting their livelihoods. And South Africa has always been at this, at these fault lines where it would be easy, and it's still easy to trigger anything, an insurrection like what we saw recently, because of the social dynamics and the socio-economic dynamics that we find ourselves in.
10.2 million people not in educational training. Policy failure, you called it. 50% in poverty. The need for bottom-up policies to grow the economy. Before I ask Panelist to come in soon after you, what do you mean by bottom-up policies to grow the economy, Tabi? What would those look like? in your view? What would you recommend?
So what we've done in the past is that we've taken resources out of rural and poor areas and allocated them to areas which are, you know, typically urban areas, even in the way we've allocated resources. So there's every time when there's an issue with an ESCOM, for instance, and there's reappropriation or appropriation of funding, what has typically happened over the years is that money has been taken out of municipalities, and not just municipalities, but programs such as housing, programs such as, you know, schooling infrastructure, where there's currently a deficit. A lot of our schools need to be funded, need to be reconstructed because some of them are not very suitable for education. Road infrastructure in poor areas needs to be needs to be rolled out. The other thing is that we need to capacitate and put in place people who understand how to manage municipalities and local governments, especially in the, you know, in the rural areas, to help with rolling out of these programs, because these programs are essentially in the ambit of municipalities and not national government. So if municipalities do not provide these services, then the rural people and poor people do not have access to these resources. So we've seen a lot of taking away of funding from these areas and allocating them differently to SAA, which is really not, you know, poor people don't utilize it, to also ESCOM, to DENEL, to a lot of these struggling state-owned entities in the past at the detriment of the poor. And if you look at what Stats SA has been producing in terms of municipality funding and infrastructure deficit, we see that there's a lot there's a lot of development and funding that needs to be allocated towards certain regions, and often regions where poor people reside.
You're on the Presidential Advisory Council. What did you say are the most urgent issues before you in the next few weeks? So something
something that we've done successfully is that we've seen the issue of ESCOM. We've prioritized ESCOM because businesses were struggling to operate, and over the past, I think, 10 years, 160 billion has been allocated to towards ESCOM. And so what we've done is that we pushed government, we pushed the president to announce finally that businesses can now generate their own electricity capacity up to 100 megawatts, which was a big thing. So we're just waiting now on the government Department of Minerals and Energy to then put together the groundwork for that to happen. One thing I'm personally working on right now is the release of spectrum. We cannot, and which is also one of those that is bottom up, because right now it's very expensive for the poor people and people in rural areas to afford data. We are, one thing that the pandemic has done is really pushed us into a digital world where we are now, selling products online, meetings online, etc. And again, what the pandemic has done is highlighted and exacerbated the inequalities between people, those who have data, those who can afford it, those who have access to internet are faring much better than those who don't. And in our case, it is not even about just only restricted to financing. There are areas in the country where people do not have broadband coverage. And so what is needed, and this is again a policy that was actually South Africa committed to in 2005 to the International Telecommunications Union, that we will be moving out of analog into digital, and therefore providing more space for spectrum so that we can have mobile spectrum. We are, we are now 2021 without any digital migration. We have had 11 ministers in the telecommunication space who have not implemented, this migration. And again, the people who are suffering the most are those who are who don't have broadband, who are poor, and who are in very remote areas of the country. So we are pushing for spectrum, the release of spectrum, and also the move from analog to digital.
Thanks. We'll come back to you. Thanks, Tabi.
It's a pleasure.
Policy failure. You stayed. I'll ask now Pali Lahola to come in straight away after Tabi to keep us on the economic track. Pali. Hello. Oh. Okay, come in.
I realized that I don't know what happened, but we lost connection. Should I go ahead?
We can hear you. Yes. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure Tabi has covered a lot of ground on these matters that are egging us as South Africa. I usually talk through illustrations, and probably I talk a lot, but as well as, and thank you very much for inviting me in the Demanders on this occasion. And I thought that perhaps one of the things that we don't have in the country are tools, foresight tools, which the apartheid regime had. Our plans are navel-gazing, and they lack the seriousness and robustness that a plan actually has. I mean, if you think about the NDP, it was a fantastic document agreed upon by many, but absolutely never left the shelf to be implemented. So the plans that we have talked about from the RDP, GEAR, ASGISA, and so on and so on, in the last 27 years, we have had about 13 things that are called plans, up to the 9-point plan and the 14-point plan. And then, of course, the new dawn and everything. And you no longer know whether this thing is a slogan or a plan. And that idle-mindedness around serious matters of the state create a serious problem for us. Now, I think we, in the RDP, we defined a socially desirable end that the apartheid regime had imposed on us. That a socially desirable end is the dismantling of apartheid, and it had these 5 priorities, making South Africa work and implementing RDP. Of course, it lacked an economically feasible plan, but nonetheless, it had an agreed upon socially desirable end with a politically mobilizing philosophy. And therefore, we needed to work out how do we make it work economically. Now, 27 years later, this is where we are with the looting and everything that has happened. Of course, Durban and all the ports and everything has come to almost a standstill. These are the numbers that we are told, 50 billion that impact on national GDP. And of course, 277 people, 300 people dead, almost 4 times the number of people that died at Sharpeville. These ones die under democracy. And they die in the month of Mandela. Now, when we think about the priorities, and I ran a statistics agency for 17 years, and some of the things we had to be interested in is what are the priorities of this country? Of course, rank number 1 was access to reliable, safe, and water, level of employment, and cost of electricity. And well, I was amazed by the priorities we had, but these are the priorities that people have talked about. And at number 15 was education. Now, if you have a society whose priorities are this, you can't expect a lot, because if education is not a priority, then it's not something you can action upon or mobilize society around. And it's not something that the politician will stand up there and say, we'll give you education. No, because it's not that kind of a priority. So this is the dilemma we have. And in part, this is where we started in 1953. In September, when Verwoerd said, what is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? And instead of actually addressing this mathematics issue and the STEM, we then introduced something called mathematics literacy. Verwoerd must be smiling all the way to heaven, seeing that his program is actually working, even today. Now, the Soweto uprisings were actually a reaction to an apartheid system and education system. 40 years later, fees must fall. I take a different view from Tabi around fees must fall. I made a submission to Care Commission, and I think Zuma was correct to say it must be free. I think we are refusing to see the national priority, that only at university we have the stadia in numbers that are adequate by race group, which is what we are trying to resolve. The students there are in numbers that are adequate proportionately, or rather it's disproportionate, but we have a good number of whites, a good number of blacks, a good number of Indians, and a good number of colors who are in that space. And they are the elite that must define, and I don't want to say they are elitist, they are the leaders of the future. And they must actually define what this country should be. It is not a big price to pay 100 billion for them to be in university and pay for everyone and give them the assignment, define for us what this country should be like. This nitpicking of saying pay for the rich, pay for the poor, it's a waste of time. And it's a waste of time, and I didn't want to go into these other issues, which are policies, are actually dysfunctional. The family fabric in South Africa doesn't lend itself to these things of a household that has this kind of income, where you think that there's a family there. The families are dysfunctional. In fact, they are abusive of women and children on trying to make that family pay for itself. Also, the policy was not saying how many children should be paid for. Is it assuming that there's only one child per household? Now, the policymakers were actually devoid of the social fabric of what South Africa is, particularly the Black family. So I believe that it is not a big price to pay for everyone at university with the assignment to ensure that they define the future. The whole thing was pushing the ball to the universities as though the universities have a lot of money and making the vice chancellors deal with something that government must be leading. That's what Afrikaners did. They said, we will pay for you. Now, if you look at this, these are the number of children that are born every year. You see, the bedroom has increased a bit, 1.2 million. It was 984,000 here. Now it's 1.2 million. Of all these children, by 2016, they started somewhere in school or university, whatever. 610,000 of them managed to write matric. We have lost 600,000 even before they write matric. 442,000 are said to have passed. Of course, there is a 30% pass rate, and only 150,000 of them actually qualify to go to a university or to a decent institution of higher learning. We have produced and reproduced this all the time, and nothing is changing. And our policies are stuck on this thing. I don't know what our thoughts, thinking heads are. And then, of course, we say 72% pass rate, 67% pass rate. We must base our pass rate on the base of 1.2 million and say, what is 150,000 of 1.2 is 10%. That pass rate, and children who successfully manage to go through a constitutionally mandated basic education, we only achieve 10%. And of course, I agree with Tabi that surely this thing of grade 1 to matric doesn't work. You need to actually include other forms of training, which unfortunately we destroy. And here we are just showing by race how different race groups have performed from grade 1 to passing grade 7, grade 9, and grade 12. And you can see the disparity of these things across time. Only at grade 1 that we have passed, we are now having grade 7, we almost got close. But beyond that point, it has been worse. In fact, it's getting worse. Here we are looking at those who actually complete a matric, and it's white, Indian, colored, and black. And here is the percentage, and here is across time. A graph that goes that way tells us that we are doing something better. A graph that goes that way, it means the country is failing. And let's see how it is failing. This is now 90% of the population that have gone to a degree. In the 70s, when everybody was paid for, they actually succeeded. In the 80s and the 90s and 1994, this is the performance of the base that goes through university. Spend 7 years there, they don't finish, blacks and coloreds. It's a problem, big problem. And of course, if you look at the net result of who actually gets a degree and where this green is white, this is white here this side, and this is black this side, you can see the proportion of whites with qualifications. It's massive. Against blacks, which is about 2%. And here is Abet and all those. And this is the biggest challenge that we have around how do we skill this population. And in absolute numbers, South Africa, with 60 million people, it has only 2 million or so people who have a high level or something degrees. With blacks, at least they're somewhat bigger, but proportionate, you can see amongst whites, they are like Korea. 45% of them have these higher qualifications, and they live a life of the Koreans, whereas this one's this side, the blacks live a different life. Now, coming to understand what it means in terms of skilled employment. This is the proportion by race and by age, from 15 to 24 to that. And yeah, at the blacks, I mean, a small proportion of them. Amongst whites, I mean, they are way above 50% with skill by age. And the Indians, so are they. That was 1994. Fast forward to 2016, you can see what has happened amongst whites and amongst Indians. And of course, this reinforces the race, the problem in South Africa. And what happens here amongst black Africans, well, at 55 to 64, they're 20%. But amongst 25 to 34, instead of they've lost their share proportionately, they've reduced that level of competence. And in part, this is, I have another slide that I'm not showing it here. But if you look at people who did the AMBACs, the trades at high school and university, or high school and so on, before we changed the technicons into universities. And now we end up with a nurse speaking English to a wound, and a person who has to go and dig a trench or fix your electricity speaks English to the electricity and so on, instead of fixing it. You find that those who are 35 and above enjoy a higher level of employment with the same qualifications or similar qualifications compared to those who are 25 to 34. Yet, those with a level of education in a degree kind of, the same proportion, more or less, find employment compared to those who do the trades, suggesting that the amalgamation of the trades with the universities degenerated and degraded the technicum quality of education, and employers are not taking them. Now, the worst thing that is happening, and of course we have this rich stats I say that really gives numbers. We cannot say the evidence is not there. The evidence is there. Now, this side we are looking at people who are employed, and this side we are looking at those who are unemployed. We are comparing 2008 in this inner color and 2021 first quarter. So this is a very, very current data set. In 2008, these were the number of people that were employed, or rather, these were the people that were employed in 2008 by age group, and these were the people that were unemployed by age group. And this is the number of people that are unemployed by age group by 2021 for all age groups. But look at what's happened in 15 to 24 and 25 to 34. These people lost their share in absolute numbers. These were 2.5 million people employed at 15 to 24 years. With a growing population, by 2001, only 1 million were employed. The 1.5 million have actually lost their share. Here is 500,000. So the younger people, 2 million of them have lost their share in this period. If they look at this democracy project, they must be asking very difficult questions. That here are cats, mother cat eating its kittens. So now we worked on scenarios as Indula I'm part of that team. And in fact, in 2016, and looked at, and scenarios are a common thing in South Africa, we've been doing them, but there's been a vacuum of trying to work on scenarios since 2008. And therefore, we have been working rudderless as a country for that period of time. And the scenarios that we came out with, you will confirm and agree with me that with the events of last week and the events that preceded this, we were in this Gwara nation, a restless, a nation torn between immobility and restless energy, a demoralized land of disorder and decay. This is where we are as a country. This was the scenario, which is Isibujwa, which is a trickle down. And here is Naila Walk, which is South Africa moving towards a destination that they hoped for since 1994. If we look at the outcomes of the NDP, social indicators, inequality, poverty, educational performance, if we look at economic indicators, employment, I've already talked about that, a capable state, governance failures in SOEs, and pushing money in SOEs that have been failed. And I think it's a shame that this is happening. Not that the SOEs are important, but surely if they are run down like that, where is accountability? And then, of course, if we look at incidents, it's Marikana, it's Nkandla, it's state capture, and then, of course, what happened in terms of looting. In fact, poverty is an anchor for all social ills. Poverty of thought is one of them. Poverty of politics. Poverty is an anchor for those ills. And we could see the poverty of politics, poverty of thought, and poverty of material well-being that enriched the poor. So we looked at these scenarios and said, what is the scenarios? What are these scenarios and how best can we get out of this as South Africa? And as in Climate, we got those. And now, before we did that, we looked at different prospects by different groupings. Business for South Africa, for instance, said if we did the following things, unemployment will come down to 15% by 2030. South Africa's economy will be 5.5 billion, which is 8 trillion, surely. Debt to GDP ratio reduced by 60%, and business confidence really rising to 70%. So this is business for South Africa, seeing the tragedy, saying, South Africa, what do you do? This is a plan by one of the provinces, Gauteng, the biggest one, showing that they could actually create 3.1 million jobs. This is the plan by government, the National Treasury and the presidency, and they come with 1 to 2 million jobs by 2030. Now, and then of course, this is the modeling work that we did with ADRS, showing debt to GDP ratio of 40%, jobs created 8 to 9 million. The question that we have to ask is if government comes with this proposal that says to us unemployment will be at 30%, which they didn't actually express in their modeling exercise. Neither did they express poverty and so on. And here we are looking at growth of 3%. When you model all these things, you realize that you cannot actually get South Africa out of this. And this is at the heart of policy. Is this all that can be done? Surely, this is underwhelming. But it is at the heart of policy making. In the modeling exercise, we think that, of course, what we do at South Africa, if you look at the portrait of growth accounting framework, if we were to think about increasing income per capita, the pathways are labor productivity. We could be looking at absorption rate, and we could be looking at terms of trade. But where we are as South Africa, we don't think that we can actually impact on young dependency ratio, nor can we impact on elderly dependency ratio, which means the social grants are with us forever. And therefore, there will not be a demographic dividend. And after 27 years, we have proven to ourselves that there is not going to be a demographic dividend, because the pathways towards growth, towards a better life, are all mediocre and have been destroyed. Of course, we are saying perhaps we could look at this differently, and we are proposing a 6-pillar policy framework for South Africa. And that 6-pillar policy framework looks at how can we reach an above 5% growth rate, which we reached between 2003 and 2008 under Asgisa, and we saw employment growing, unemployment dropping somewhat, inequality remaining still a very serious problem.
Just providing consultant services.
Pardon? So our growth rate at the moment is 1% where we are. And we are arguing that if we looked at business as usual, that 1% will go to about 0.7 percentage points to 1.7. If we look at micro reforms, which is the reforms that are contained in the Treasury document of 2019 and the core of the reconstruction and recovery plan, those will have only an impact of 0.27 percentage points, which means if the base is 2%, if it were 2%, then we'll be at 2.9%. And then at trade and industry, all those reforms will add another 0.38, which is 3. We are moving towards a 3.1%. If we temper the macroeconomic frame, there we could get another 1.43%, which is trade credit extension and so on. But this is a sealed program. It cannot be touched. And therefore, we are depriving ourselves the prospects. Okay, now I'm pardon, Daddy.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Can wind up.
Oh, yes, I am.
Can wind up, I said.
Done. 1 minute, I'll be done.
Yeah.
And of course, 0.5% in terms of social policy. The social policies, including the extension of the 350, it's not going to increase the GDP, but it has a social impact. And of course, private sector support, 0.79. And finally, external support and will come in. And then, of course, you look at the provincial, and therefore 5.7% would be possible. This is what we are putting before government and before ourselves as society to say, what if? And that what if we sat together to look at this what if, perhaps South Africa will have a better future. And for that what if, everything must be up for discussion. There cannot be a sealed possibility. Thank you very much.
You economists have really frightened us today. Out of 60 million, out of 60 million population, only 2 million can be said to be educated. The race question is big. Well, maybe now I just would turn to Mr. Bisi, please. Can you raise our hopes a bit? We'll come back to number crunching. Mr. Bisi?
Well, I'm afraid, Ibo, I'm not going to raise your hopes. By the way, firstly, I have to apologize for not matching party's colorfulness. I hope you won't mind.
Well, the yellow color is mine.
There are certainly many factors involved in this problem we're dealing with, and a number of perspectives have been offered. I am zooming into the national question. I hope I won't disappoint you, Ibo. I'm not the policy type. I'm still bogged down in explaining the spectacle or the oddity of a former president and the leader of the oldest liberation movement being supported by a kinsman on account of a fellow ethnicity or similar ethnicity against what they thought was an intruding civil authority to arrest him, and they look at the civil authority as a foreign entity persecuting their kinsmen. So this spectacle, how is it possible that you would have this happening in this country in 2021? And indeed, what subsequently happened after JZ's arrest obviously has its origins at Nkandla over that weekend of the 28th, 29th of July. So here's my thesis. What happened, what we are seeing actually are unintended consequences of a strategy that was used by the ANC, a strategy aimed at a national integration. These are unintended consequences of that and the strategy employed in the early 90s. What we saw in Nkandla was actually a return by Jacob Zuma to ethnic entrepreneurship, a strategy he applied between 2005 and 2008. One of the problems, by the way, I'm going to time myself, I prefer to for about 15 minutes or so, Ibo, but I will certainly not exceed 20 minutes. One of the challenges that the ANC faced upon return in 1990 was to obviously reestablish itself throughout the country as a national movement. And one of the problems was lack of acceptance among certain communities, primarily because of ethnic stereotypes and ethnic loyalties. And of course, this was not entirely unexpected in South Africa because, I mean, the entire apartheid strategy or the strategy of the Union government beginning in 1910 was to establish its hegemony through divide and rule. And that, of course, entailed ethnic balkanization, beginning with the formation of the Union in 1910, when Africans were denied franchise, which meant that they would not be citizens of the Union. What then followed was a territorial segregation legislated through 1913 Land Act, essentially keeping blacks on the one hand and whites within the Union, and the blacks were segregated into a multiplicity of ethnic-oriented Bantustans. And after that, you had the passing of a law, Native Administrative Act in 1927, that defined Africans not as citizens, but as tribesmen, right? That each African belonged to a village somewhere under a chief. And this, unfolded throughout the 20th century or so. So what the ANC found in 1990 was not entirely unexpected. You had these ethnic stereotypes, you had a number of monolingual, monocultural communities which serve as a fertile ground for ethnic prejudice, ethnic stereotypes mainly. And these are fine. I mean, stereotypes are commonplace to humanity. They are not anything new, but the problem is when those stereotypes are harnessed for political purposes, politicizing ethnic identity. That's the particular problem that the ANC faced in 1990, especially in the instance of KZN, politicization of ethnic identity. Just before I come to KZN, as I said earlier, this was not peculiar to KZN. You had a similar problem elsewhere. For instance, in places like Limpopo, in places at Northwest, where you had new provinces being created, provinces that were made up of Bantustans, of different ethnic groups coming together. There were ethnic tensions there, and these tensions came up especially over the election of leaders. In KZN, for instance, the person that led, especially the southern part of KZN, of Natal at the time, which was Durban, Durban area, southern Natal, so-called, was Musiwa Likota. Musiwa Likota is obviously a native Zulu speaker, born in Kronstadt, but his political identity was shaped in Natal, all right? So he emerged naturally as a UDF leader. But what had happened in Natal with the ANC now rebuilding itself, it had to face the problem that was posed by Inkatha, where Inkatha throughout the 80s had distorted the image of the ANC, cast it as a Xhosa dominated party, as a way of galvanizing support amongst locals. And so Inkatha, was this vanguard of Zulu culture and Zulu interests, and Zulus were generally, that was the rhetoric, urged and at times coerced to get a job. You had to be a member of Inkatha at some places. And the ANC was painted as the enemy that mainly catered for Xhosa speakers. So the problem then that they encountered upon unburning was this stigma that they had. And so they had to create a friendly face for the party, a familiar face that locals could identify with, especially those who believed that the ANC was indeed a Xhosa-dominated party. And so to have that familiarity with the ANC, they had to show up the Zulu aspect or the representativeness of the ANC, especially amongst conservative Zulu speakers. And most local leaders there, Spundabele, Zweli Mkhize, Dr. Mg, and a whole lot of them, didn't really embrace these ethnic identities, a display of these ethnic identities. And of course, the ANC is a nationalist movement, discouraged embrace of these ethnic identities and playing to that. And so they were a little bit, awkward about involving or getting involved in that exercise, and did not really have the credentials of traditional Zulu people, pretty much. So these were urban and universal figures of the ANC. And so JZ presented himself as the one person who could be a linkage between the ANC and KZN, especially conservative folks who believed that the ANC was indeed a Xhosa-dominated party. And JZ fitted the bill because, JZ embraced and quite liked dressing up in Zulu traditional regalia, is into singing and dancing Zulu songs, warrior song Indlamu, and was very happy and comfortable participating, especially in the annual Zulu rituals, Shaka Day, and all sorts of local rituals that most people, especially the younger leaders who were part of the UDF, would not attend at all. But JZ participated in this. And the main idea, actually, and this all happened with the support and encouragement of the ANC. In fact, the national leadership supported JZ. JZ was constantly contested by Jeff Hadden. And Jeff, of course, did not quite have the Zulu traditional image. He's a sophisticated fellow, a lawyer. Perhaps his Zulu was not even that fluent. And so it did not quite fit the bill of presenting a familiar traditional face of the ANC to the locals. And so JZ succeeded in this. In 1994, the ANC lost marginally, and most people actually were saying, had the elections not been rigged in KZN, it was quite possible that the ANC would have won. They lost marginally as well in 1999, but won in 2004 and became the largest party. And that growth within the province where the ANC had largely been seen as a Xhosa-dominated party was largely ascribed to the success of JZ's strategy. Let me go back to the point I made before I move further beyond that point, is that the strategy of creating ethnic representativity and diversity in the ANC had been pursued elsewhere, not just in KZN, and not just in the Free State where Terra Likota was sent to, but also in places like Limpopo, as I said, as I mentioned earlier. And this is the interesting part, especially in Limpopo. So the idea is that you have ethnic tensions, and you are aware that if one person is elected over the other, there's a possibility that fellow kinsmen might withdraw from the party because they are against a particular leader from a particular ethnicity. And so and this was a kind of problem they faced, especially in Limpopo. So what they did there, which was quite interesting, was to bring in Joel Netshitenzhe. Prior to this unification conference in Limpopo, which is predominantly Pedi-speaking province, and most folks wanted Aaron Motsoaledi as the inaugural chairperson. But there were others, not Pedi-speaking, or didn't quite like, or did not prefer Aaron Motsoaledi. And so you had this threat of a conference actually disintegrating. So they decided that they would bring in Joel Netshitenzhe. And the interesting thing about Joel is obviously a native Venda speaker. And so because he was Venda speaking, therefore he was accepted as a local. He belonged because originally he was from Venda. But Joel's identity, ethnicity is not a dominant part of his identity. In fact, you know, even though he's Venda speaking, most people hardly even hear Joel speaking Venda. He's one of those Ulster nationalists, you know, doesn't want, kind of frown upon these ethnic identities and would prefer kind of universal appeal and all that. And also in the way he carries himself, it shows. And so the Pedi-speaking, even though they were all aware that Joel was Venda speaking, almost all of them enthusiastically voted for Joel. Because in his case, the ethnic aspect of his identity was not the dominant part. In Joel, they saw a national leader of the ANC, an intellectual, right? And so even though initially his candidature was predicated on the basis of him being a homeboy, he was a homeboy that was embraced by everybody because he had this universal appeal. So you have a two-pronged strategy here to some degree, that your candidature has to be based on you being a local. You have to be a native, so to speak. However, it helps if your identity goes beyond the ethnic identity. And so the ANC then was able to use that in the case of Joel, present him as a local and yet a universal figure to unify the province. And that was partly the strategy in relation to JZ. But what JZ then did, especially when he started getting into legal problems beginning in 2005, when he was fired as a deputy president as a result of the charges related to the arms deal. And later there was a rape case and all that. What JZ did, having established himself as a linkage pretty much between the ANC, KZN, and National, bringing locals who had been resistant to the ANC behind the ANC. He then turned around and projected the accusations that had been leveled against him as some kind of a persecution against him because he was Zulu speaking. And he knew, he was well aware of the sensitivity of this ethnic sentiment and prejudice against one group or another. So he said, they don't want me to be president because I am Zulu, right? And so local Zulu speakers obviously rallied around it because they saw a persecution of their fellow local person on the basis of a shared identity. So it was an attack against Zuluness. And you know, he uses this quite well, even in the rape case, where instead of justifying in English, he uses Zulu, Zulu idiom. So he taps into this also, you know, Zulu chauvinism, pretty much against women, to appeal to the conservatives. And so by the time that you go to Polokwane, the conference that elected JZ in 2007, JZ was, you know, mobilizing pretty much an ethnic group towards Polokwane. And to the surprise of many people, right, that some of these people, when they got to Polokwane, were even singing Zulu traditional songs, Indlamu, warrior songs, at an ANC conference, which was pretty much unheard of. And the idea was that they were going to vote for their own. And of course, earlier, you had these fabricated emails to spread or plant the idea that, you know, JZ, to reinforce the idea that JZ was not preferred for the presidency because he was Zulu and the ANC should remain closer. So you know, the kinsfolk are mobilized to ensure that their own succeeds at the conference, to prove that Zulus have the same right as Xhosas, so to speak, in the context of that debate, to be elected into the ANC. And of course, that strategy succeeds. So what you have there in Nkandla was pretty much a return to that strategy. Three things we saw at Nkandla which affirm the ethnic mobilization point that I'm making. Firstly, you had clips, you know, videos circulating in social media of people calling on Zulus to come and protect JZ. And in this particular clip, this young fellow was even emphatic about Baden Zimande even coming. Where is he? You know, he's Zulu, so he must also be seen at Nkandla. And I'm sure there are many other videos like that. And the second one was Amabuto, you know, Zulu military regiment at Nkandla. And JZ is seen here talking to them and saying, I'm glad that you came. And I hope that those in authority would see your unhappiness, and your unhappiness might hopefully change their minds against incarcerating me, right? And thirdly, JZ pretty much turns his back at the ANC. You had NEC members who were there at Nkandla to make sure, you know, to calm him down, make sure that these things don't get out of hand. And one of them was Lindiwe Sisulu. So Lindiwe appears on TV on Sunday night. He gets asked by journalists whether he had seen JZ. She says, yes, I managed to speak to him for a minute or two, but we didn't have time. He was rushing out to meet Amabuto. So at that moment, the most important constituency for JZ, or people to talk to, was not the ANC. It was Amabuto. At that moment, JZ was not a nationalist leader of the ANC, but he was a Zulu man, pretty much, you know, invoking and rallying all these Zulu ethnic resources behind it. And so this is a strategy that the ANC used, Ibo, as I close in the next minute or two. They used quite effectively for good reason in the early 90s. But JZ turned it around in the mid and in the early 2000s, and he did exactly that at Nkandla. But what is also happening is that he's egged on, he's encouraged in this ethnic entrepreneurship by provincial leaders. Because what you have in KZN is a neo-patrimonial ANC built around JZ. JZ has set himself up as a godfather of KZN politics. And so these guys know that if JZ campaigns against you, if you don't have JZ in your corner, you might not win provincial position, provincial leadership. So they are pussyfooting around him, also joining in this idea that it's unfair to arrest JZ, you must give him a pardon. And so in saying so, they are reinforcing this personality cult that has evolved around JZ and reaffirming this neo-patrimonial personalized nature of ANC politics in KZN. So you still have a lot of challenges in KZN, especially in ensuring that you bring those folks more into the fold of national universal politics. And that's the challenge that the ANC faces in a serious way in KZN. And the Nkandla spectacle was just a manifestation of the persistence of that problem. Thank you, Ibo. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Mr. BC. You've made your case. You've made a case. It's not always politically correct to discuss ethnicity, but academics have to deal with facts as they are. Thanks, Mr. BC. I'll move on to the next speaker quickly, Noboniso Gasa. Please don't feel too constrained. Try to limit yourself to your time. We will extend the time as necessary to 8 o'clock. We want to make sure that all our panelists and discussers do what they have to do in terms of what they're prepared to do in this discussion. Noboniso.
How much time? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, how much time? How much time?
10 minutes?
Okay. Please stop me when I go over. Look, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this this conversation.
Most welcome, Noboniso.
This is the first time that I've actually sat down to talk to anybody about what has happened in KZN beyond, I suppose, just a few social media comments, mostly about what was happening when it was happening. I've had to take a step back and really watch how the conversation is unfolding. And I'm very grateful that Mcebisi has gone before me, because he touches on a number of issues that are deeply concerning for me, and I'll explain why. But firstly, I just want to say that from the colleagues who have spoken, what we are discussing is no doubt the failures of the post-1994 project. I'm reminded of the Argentinian poet and writer Eduardo Galeano, who says, history never says goodbye. History says, see you later. Because I think a number of issues that we're dealing with here indicate the difficulties that we have had to actually deal with very complex legacies of South African history. And in South Africa, we talk a lot about our history and its continued presence in our era. But I don't think that we do as much as we think we are doing in actually really understanding different ways in which we can undo that history. The first of those that I want to talk about is picking up on what Mcebisi has said, it's about the special design of this country and the way in which you continue to produce it in the present. So when you look at all the horrible statistics that were given on education, and you look at someone like me, for example, who grew up in a monocultural and monolingual community in the Eastern Cape, and really met people, Africans, who spoke other languages when I went to university. And you look at how we are doing on university education and the fact that so many young people are being left behind. We are reproducing these kinds of identities and very limited ways of understanding who we are in this country. We're not giving young people, besides all the other arguments that are important about why we need to have education. But I think that if you want to build a different kind of state, the state that was articulated in the RDP, the social desirable outcome that undoes the political and economic legacy of this country, you've got to look at education, not just education for the sake of it, even though that is important, but as a process and a tool that can help you in rebuilding and thinking differently about the kind of society that you want to have. And exposure and giving young people especially opportunity to meet people that they would not normally meet is a very, very good way of starting. The problem that we see, that we're talking about, and the problem that we really don't want to talk about, that is very, very uncomfortable, the problem of ethnic entrepreneurship, as if I can borrow from Mcebisi, is particularly difficult to talk about because the post-apartheid state has not really applied itself on how it is going to undo those pockets of identity that were shaped by apartheid system and in ways that are very toxic for a democratic society. What we see in KZN is pretty much what we see in other provinces. And this is an indictment on the ANC in particular, because the ANC continues to reproduce this through specific legislation that it pushes in this country as we speak. So you have, instead of undoing the Bantu Authority, the legacy of the Bantu Authorities Act, the Black Administration Act, and these divisions of Africans as these tribes that have these primordial identities and loyalties, it reproduces that specifically in ways that actually overlap with apartheid design. So you look at, in December last year, President Ramaphosa signed into law the traditional leadership and Khoisan, the Traditional Leadership and Khoisan Act, Governance Act, which basically supposedly recognizes the role of traditional leaders and the role of the Khoi and the San. Even the Khoisan thing is actually extremely inaccurate and is pretty much part of colonial history. But most importantly, you have 9 provinces, and those provinces overlap with the tribal identities that were circumscribed by apartheid regime. You have in post-apartheid South Africa, in those provinces, tribal authorities that supposedly recognize the heritage and the cultural identities of people who live there, but actually go and overlap with the borders, with the tribal authorities that were designed by apartheid in the form of homelands. This is what the ANC has done in the last 27 years. So this crisis of imagination and this unwillingness to actually really look at South African society and see how you take apart the apartheid special design and its multiple legacies results in loyalties that are defined by Kingsman affiliations, but not just that, by interest in mining and manipulation of legacies, of heritage, and traditional leadership from kings and all of that, in order to have hands in your minds. You look at what is happening in the Platinum Belt right now. You look at the so-called success story of the Royal Bafokeng. That very distillation of what Royal Bafokeng is a colonial and apartheid legacy. It's the same as others, Makgatla Bakgafela and all of that, and the struggles down in the Eastern Cape Wonderland. So what JZ is doing, he traffics in what he knows, he trades in what he knows. But he also trades in what he knows because he knows that the ANC is ambivalent in dealing with these issues. You saw, Mcebisi has talked about what happened in the early 90s, but for me, and I was working for the ANC at that time, the most shocking image that illustrated this was a weekend when JZ, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and Jeff Radebe and Sbu Ndebele wore Zulu regalia and were, to talk to people at a rally. It was so jarring in the way in which it was crudely using what is understood to be a Zulu stereotype of loyalty to tribal identity. But it was also an admission, I think, of the ANC's inability to handle the challenges that came with their position, the position that had been formed for so many decades, that actually were attempting to break down these notions of ethnic mobilization as we saw in homelands. It appeared that the only way they thought they could campaign against Butelis was to actually speak his language. And I think they lay the seeds of what we see today. So Zuma looms large because, of course, for the last 15 years at least, he has been doing this in the courts, in the theater, in the national theater, and creating a spectrum. But everywhere, in every province, at every level, you find these different ways of mobilization. And I think this is going to be part of the undoing of this country. The second, because it's never just about ethnic pride and all these things. It's about resources. And in KZN, just before the Constitutional Court judgment on Zuma, there was a judgment that the Constitutional Court had handed down against Ingonyama Trust, which was charging people in rural KZN for rents, to pay rents in land that is customarily theirs. Ingonyama Trust itself being a construction of the apartheid, the last gift that de Klerk gave us just a week before elections, and created this, and ostensibly to bring IFP to the elections. So in the last 25 years, we have been unable really to think in a focused way on how do we undo the apartheid spatial design. So not only in terms of ethnic identities, but also in terms of, the interracial stuff. So what you see in Phoenix partly is also a result of that. The second issue that I want to talk about quite quickly is that, unlike Adam, I don't think that it's either or. I don't think that we should read this as poverty, as food revolt, or or manipulated political process by a particular faction. I think it can be. I think it can be both, and I believe it is both. But I think it's also more than that. Here, it's important to also look at the timing here. I'm not saying at any other time it wouldn't happen, but this happens in the middle of a pandemic. that generally the South African government has not handled it well, particularly in relation to what COVID and the various decisions that have been taken mean for poor people. From lockdown to vaccine and all of this. So generally, these people that we see in the streets are part of communities throughout South Africa that have been feeling isolated, neglected, unheard in the last 18 months. Since the introduction of hard lockdown, there's never really been a conversation with the majority of African people to actually say, this is what COVID means, and these are the decisions that we're taking. The state apparatus, particularly the army and the police, have policed the various lockdowns in relation to African communities in ways that have been abusive, that have been authoritarian, and that have been completely out of touch with how they should have. So instead of talking to people and explaining why they have to give up certain liberties, we have seen the Minister of Police actually reveling in taking those liberties and actually being quite mean about it, especially in African communities. If you look at the kind of arrests, if you look at the kind of even the brutality by elements in the military in those communities. So over and above inequality, exclusion, and all the historical issues that people are having, there's a low intensity resentment, and it's very strong. There's a low intensity resentment against government. And Cyril has inherited that in many ways because of what had happened with hollowing out of institutions and diverting resources and people finding themselves unemployed and all of that. But I think that also his handling of the COVID crisis and its implications for South African communities has been particularly alienating for people. For example, I just want to make a very quick example. You know, people have talked about how Cyril has addressed the nation and all of that. But one thing that has been incredibly absent in his style of communication and the content of his message has been to speak specifically to African communities. So the government's approach to COVID, you know, unavoidable as it is, I'm not arguing that that you have social distancing, that you have lockdown. I'm not arguing with any of that, but its approach has almost been like you are talking about South Africa as a society that is like New Zealand. That if you say people should social distance, that it's easy to do that. And there's been absence of empathy, but also intelligent awareness of what these changes mean to people. A childhood friend of mine who lives in sightseeing Cape Town, when the hard lockdown came, so I phoned her to try and see if she understood and how she was coping. Her most important question and comment at the time was that she kept on saying, "Nomboniso, the streets are deserted." For her, who lives in such an overcrowded community, for her who shares her house with 8 other kids, and it's a shack, the emptiness in the street loomed large. No one has ever really spoken about this. No one has ever really spoken about why were these communities not decongested. And on top of that, you had massive presence of the military in African communities. These people who, even if they wanted to social distance, to go to the bathroom, to go to the toilet, they had to get out of their house and go to the zinc toilet that they share with 30 other people. These people who live in these conditions, you communicate with them in ways that show complete inability to understand what they could be struggling with. And instead of communicating with them, in fact, you intimidate them with the presence of the military. One of the striking things about COVID in African communities was, of course, the adjustment of funerals and all that. Nowhere did the president of the country actually speak to people and say, we know you have to suspend your rituals. We appeal to you to handle this as you often handle emergency. So there's an alienation of communities, and especially poor people and community and African communities, to be specific. So whatever machinations, the so-called insurrectionists and how it interlinks with poverty, with unemployment and all these things, it happens at a time when people are actually tested to the brink. And I agree with Tabi. That it's unfair to blame, to put this only on the door of the poor. And to the extent that people have been forced to loot, I'm not talking about those who drive Mercedes Benzes and go and grab TVs and all that, but to the extent that people actually have to loot for food, I do think that the responsibility has to be laid squarely on the governing party. Finally, I think that the biggest mistake that we can make at this time in South Africa is to be complacent about this. I think that I agree with Adam that violence in this country is embedded in our DNA, that our protests are violent. But it's important not to isolate the kind of violence that we've seen. So when we talk about strategic hitting of infrastructure in this, we need to be mindful of the fact that for the last 5 years, we have seen the sabotage of railway. We have seen trains being unable to move in many communities, and the inability of government to actually come to terms with what is the cause of this and how to address it. So I think over and above all these things that have been raised by colleagues, I think it's time for us to reckon with the kind of society we have been building post-1994 and to deal with history in ways that are imaginative. At the moment, and with all due respect to Tabi and others, at the moment, the processes of government, the government itself comes across as wasteland, as a place where there are no ideas, and as a place where there's no imagination. Thank you.
Thanks, Nomboniso. Very profound. You brought in a new dimension. We'd almost forgotten the pandemic. And I think the points made are noted. I'll now call on Seth, our last speaker. Seth Cooper.
Thank you, Ivo. I'm not going to repeat any of the issues that have been pointed out by the previous speakers. 27 years after democracy, South Africa remains what it is accused of. But importantly, there is the perpetuation of the abuse of the majority by the majority party. And what we've seen is internal ANC battles, which are legion, becoming clearly factionalized, the inability to deal with them within the party mechanisms, the inability to deal with them in public spaces like the prosecution authorities, and engulfing the country in this mess. There's been a denial of reality by those elected, and part of that problem was identified by the Constitutional Court in June last year, when it said that the proportional representation system needs to take account of constituencies. I won't rehash some of the issues raised, but I just want to point out that certain scholars, in particular from within the ANC, have pointed out that 2% of ANC members result in the peopling of government at all levels. Elected positions are then determined by the party, and we've seen the mess that comes with lack of accountability, with Jacob Zuma escaping many, many motions of no confidence. So we remain deeply divided, especially along ethnic lines, and critically along chronically violent lines. We have disturbed social relations, and we cannot talk of community. You know, people glibly, not in this forum, thankfully, but people glibly talk of our community. They don't exist in the form in which they did when we were growing up, and even pre-democracy, where there was unification against the previous system. So that sense of community has just been deracinated. Our inability to deal with the nightmares of our past that constantly impinge on the present, and which will be the nightmares of the future unless openly dealt with. And this under the oldest liberation organization in the world. Structural violence is something that has now become embedded in the South African system. We talk of service delivery. You know, it's a unique phrase that describes all manner of resentment, as Nombuniso pointed out, all manner of objection to dealing with issues at a local and other level. But the dependency that that term has created is part of what we're dealing with a dumbed down education system that Padi has adequately referred to, and with the inability to deal with our past effectively. Note, just as a key footnote, that there have been scores of political assassinations in KZN. We who talk about these issues with seething frustration, anger, and that resentment where we turn against others who are perceived as benefiting when they are not. And it's quite rich that when this started, soon after President Zuma was arrested, various groups said, stop the looting. Yet they themselves did very little to stop the looting that has progressively transpired and openly happened in the last 2 decades or so. So when you have that clear example of looting from on high, what do we expect those who are disaffected, terribly marginalized, and live on the periphery, the fringes? That is the condition, sad though it may be, of the majority of people in this country, indicating that many of us are alienated from socio-economic political processes. And when I say us, I mean the population. We see in what has been unfurling all the things that commentators have pointed to, but it's also the terrible power of the powerless, removed from all sorts of systems, particularly under democracy. Ironically, Ibo, we who, many of us talking and many of us commenting, many of us in positions of influence and beneficiaries of democracy, are now the system we fought against before. When people have nothing to root themselves to social processes, they become extremely vulnerable and can be the tinder to spark a violent eruption. And it's easy to label as criminal from the comfort of our middle-class homes. But we've had unfinished business. The state just simply continued the old form, and indeed the content hasn't much changed. Others have mentioned the retention of race-based classification and various other throwbacks to the apartheid era, which I will not repeat. Importantly, the elephant in the room of race and its sequelae, that in particular the last two commentators have mentioned, remain the elephant in the room, and most commentators tend to pussyfoot around it. The question we need to ask is, did we put the face, or was it, pardon the compromising pun, the comprodorization of the liberation movement, Igbo, as you described them? As the record is patently showing, the apartheid state turned many in leadership in exile and inside the country into working for them. Zuma has threatened, but refused to reveal those names. When I asked TRC commissioners, including the late Tom Mantata, about dealing with those who work for the other side, they said it would create problems. For whom? Who have we been protecting who masqueraded as freedom fighters but were paid apartheid agents? State, law and order, leadership failure, and democracy eluding the majority when they can see that castle on the hill belongs to and is paid for by ill-gotten gains. What is that castle worth when around it there are shacks? And yes, during apartheid, Black life, especially African, was regarded as cheap. That's become inured in our culture. So we need to deal with these fault lines as well as the adequately represented economic and other ills we have in our society. Violence as part of our socialization and culture has been endemic. But unlike Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, where there were liberation wars inside those countries, ours is now the war within. One, within the ANC for power, privilege, and profiteering. Two, the various so-called population groups fighting to let go of the past and explore the possibility of a new nation bereft of self-interested leadership. And four, mediocre leadership that continues to prevail from a flawed political economic system. The time now is to move beyond the politics of the past and reset this country to make it what it ought to be and prevent the limitations of human possibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks very much. Eddie, not least, but can you do a sum up for us? Tie the loose ends for us in your smart way. Please, Eddie.
Thank you, Ivo. I think I've been following this discussion. I mean, the points that were raised by from the beginning with Adam, and of course through the two economic presentations, and of course you can say studies is also more like, you could say, the projections, you know, using statistical analysis, the VCs and Ombodiso, and now you could say Seth Cooper's, you know, he spoke like an elder as well. And I think that I understand the debate that we have it now, because it's a continuation of the debate that is happening within South Africa. And it's really about how do we characterize
what has just happened in South Africa, and also versus the issues of perception. The elements of characterization here, I put them into 6 which came up in this debate. The first one is the political, you could say a characterization that is based on political consideration, the intra-party, ANC intra-party political dynamics, questions of leadership. And I think what we didn't talk about is how these political factors find expression in disputes over the elections on the African continent. So it's really the political factors. And I think you find there's a thinking that says, to understand what has just happened in South Africa, you must then go into the political dynamics, intra-party ANC politics, issues of leadership, factionalism, and so on. Then you could say the socio-economic argument. So here, this is where Paddy and our economists have been talking about that these protests are a reflection of you could say the socio-economic factors that have not been addressed since by the South African post-apartheid transition, issues of inequality, poverty, unemployment, exclusion, and so on. It's really an explosion of this that is due to these factors. And then, of course, you have the security element, the security argument. This is what Adam spoke about as well, and some few people, and Nomboniso referred to it as well. And to say once you use the security argument, then you have to use force to respond to this challenge. So it's no longer a political intra-party factor or socioeconomic poverty issues, but this one is a security issue, to threat to the security of the state. Then you have to deploy the army, but even the army, when it is there, not to quell down riots and so, but then to deal with a threat to the security of the state. So really, this is the you could say the third argument. Then Mkebisi and Nondubodisa to a certain extent, then they introduced the national question. And the national question, I think both of them narrowed it down to the question of ethnicity, the mobilization of ethnicity, weaponization of ethnicity. And I think they put across quite a very interesting argument. And then Nomboniso also spoke about what you can call, she said, is the crisis of post-1994 project. But I thought perhaps if we're to follow that argument, perhaps what has just happened, if you follow that line of thinking, should be perhaps the collapse of the post-1994 consensus, not just project. Consensus in the sense that there was an understanding that this is how this transition were to unfold, and there was a lot of narrative around it, empowerment, black empowerment, and all these elements of it. And perhaps this consensus that has brought us up to here, it hit some walls. So if you follow this, so I will say it's beyond a project, but rather some sort of a consensus that had kept this country, the so-called rainbow nation, to get up to now. And then finally, I think I thought the analysis by Nomboniso was also very interesting, that perhaps it was a reflection of the COVID lockdown saturation point, that the COVID lockdown measures were so intense, so strong, and so heavy on the shoulders of people. They just needed such kind of provocation to spill that into the streets. So I think if you were to ask me, Ibo, which of this line of thinking best describe what has just happened, I would say perhaps a combination of these. And perhaps it depends on how you look at them. I don't want to go into the insurrection, counter-revolutionary debate, but I think all of them, these 6 arguments or line of thinking, are quite useful in helping us to characterize what has just unfolded in South Africa. But I'll come back to some parts of it. But then also for me, from where I work, when these things were happening, I was not in South Africa. I was doing my work on the African continent. And I was receiving all these messages about condolences and so on. So for me also, the issue that I thought, one, the characterization, but also the perception of what is happening. So the characterization is an analytical, is the guys we have here on the panel, the analysts and the politicians trying to characterize. But for the ordinary people and for those who are not in South Africa, how do they perceive, or how did they perceive what unfolded in South Africa. And I thought there were three lines of perception. The first one was to look to see this as a civil war happening in South Africa. And this was predominantly from the external dimension. I mean, I had a friend of mine who was even visiting quite recently. He thought, you know, South Africans are slaughtering each other with pangas in the streets. And when he started understanding what is happening, he said, no, but this is what happened in my country in March. People were looting stores and so, because this is largely what was happening. Even if you look at the police reports, the fatalities that arose out of these incidents were not due to exchange of fire or violence, but largely due to stampede, people trying to break into the shopping malls, stepping over each other and so. So the perception of a civil war out there, and I think it's something that I saw that the GCIS was trying to address, deploying some of the ministers on Al Jazeera and so on. But I think it's something that South Africa did not do enough to try to assist the external eyes to understand what was happening in South Africa. And there are people out there who still think this was a civil war, or this is a civil war that South Africa is burning down. There was this global Pan-African campaign for saving South Africa and so on. So I think it's something that South African leaders did not do enough to try to correct this perception, because it's not true. And it was, of course, it happened quite over a few days, but it was largely something which is very common. It has happened in quite a number of African cities, and also in parts of other countries, even in the United States, even in France quite recently, of people breaking out over some grievance and breaking into stores and looting and so on. It's something that happened even in some parts of Europe during the COVID lockdowns last year. So the perception of this as a civil war, and I think it's something that the South African leaders could look at it. The second, of course, is the class war. That is a class war. So it's linked to the socio-economic, you could say, line of thinking, to say this is a war of, a class war linked to poverty and so on and so on. But also there's been a conversation, largely you find part of it, of course, in KZN, whether this was a racial war. So there are those who see this as a racial war, especially with what happened in parts of KZN, that this was a war. I'm told that somebody was telling me actually that there were some, even in some historically white areas, some white South Africans were armed to teeth, even with petrol bombs, ready to fight for their lives, because they were fearing that there were all these black people who were going to storm over their properties and put end to their lives. So I think the issues of perception is something perhaps we didn't attend to it adequately, because issues of perception, some perceptions could not be, of course, they may not be the same as very thoroughly thought out analysis, but perception can also influence action, and in some cases can result in some of the things. And I think there is also a broader issue that Paddy raised, which was talking about 1994 and so on, of the, the relationship. You have vision, you have the plan, you have actions, and you have slogans. And sometimes after 94, South Africa tried to translate its vision into plans, the RDPs, then later a number of other plans. Then now we have the national development plans. But whether some of these plans are translated into action or degenerate into slogans, and I think it's something that he raised, but it's also an African debate, how we use, how visions are translated into plans. But then these plans, instead of becoming action, then they become slogans, they become part of the political narrative, political discourse, and we use them, but there's no proper follow-up mechanism. There are no fiscal resources to put into action these plans. There's no national buy-in, and so on and so on. So it's a big issue, something that, of course, even when we talk about Agenda 2063, you look at also the UN SDGs, you look at some of these issues, the plans versus the actions that should arise out of those plans, versus also the dangers of these plans becoming, slogans that are used by the political elite to rationalize or to justify certain actions and certain measures. So, Ibo, in conclusion, for me, sitting here and looking at this from where I am, Africa's problems, they look like, in South Africa, there's what they call bubblegum music. Bubblegum music is it's repetitive songs, repetitive songs that to distinguish one from another, you may have to find some drum, some lousy drum there and so on. But it's when you're listening to it, it's like the same music, it's like the same song. It's being played You know, so Africa's problems, if you look at the reports that the APRM have produced, Africa's problems, they read like bubblegum music. They are all the same. It's just slight variations. So what has happened in South Africa is happening in other parts of the continent, and it has happened even this year. There are quite a number of African countries that have experienced the same incidents of mass looting, people rising up and rebelling against COVID lockdowns and so on. And so perhaps it's the scale, perhaps it's the dimension, perhaps it's the socio-economic setting as well. You could say even the national question, maybe in other cases, there's no racial element to it. But this South Africa, what has happened in South Africa has happened in other African countries, even during the course of this year. And then I think the issues of early warning. If you look at the APRM reports we did on South Africa, and we do even in other African countries, we do warn that if you don't attend to the socioeconomic challenges, issues of inequality, poverty, these will one day escalate and become your political and security problems. So this is what has happened in South Africa, where the socioeconomic issues, they pile up, they build up, and then one day it needs a trigger, and then they become a political and a socioeconomic challenge for the country. And the Pan-African conversation about our challenges, I think, is dominated by issues of integration, the African Union, and so on, the broad macro issues of development, and then, of course, the peace and security issues, even the peace and security element, the discussion, regional conversation, is around the macro issues, big conflicts, the jihadists, all of these things. There is not enough conversation about these issues that Cooper characterized perhaps even much better than a lot of us, about these micro issues that happen within countries that can then lead to what we have just witnessed in South Africa. And I think I want to leave it there to say that, Ivo, you have a platform, and then we have platforms across the continent, that perhaps we need to talk more about these issues, this bubblegum music script, that all you find in all African countries: unemployment, inequality, poverty, and all these problems, the sufferings that Nomboniso described, you know, about people who living in informal settlements and so on, that this is what is missing in our regional conversation, the conversation or Pan-African conversation about the problems facing our continent. Our problems are like bubblegum music. We need both the domestic and also the regional perspective, and in how we deal and tackle these problems. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Eddie. Thanks for a good job. Thanks very much, Eddie. It leaves me now just to close the meeting by just saying the following. I think that Adam set up the pace for us with the tripartite: inequality, security, state capacity. I think we should add national question. We have, through the panelists and the discussants, sufficiently, I think, analyze the failures, the cause of the failures, and the time bomb that Eddie had just spoken about as not being peculiar to South Africa. It's an African problem, but I think it's peculiar to South Africa in the sense that the level of inequalities are deeper. As that famous quotation from Marx, it's not that someone is living in a shack, it's the fact that the shack is in the shadow of a palace. And that describes South Africa, the problem of inequality, sufficiently. The issue of security that Adam has really ventilated in great detail, and linked as it is to state capacity, not only in terms of the capacity of the state to react, to respond to just challenges as happened a few weeks ago, but also in terms of delivery, the porous nature of the state bureaucracy. Those of us who are familiar with the South African bureaucracy, we've been in South Africa a number of times in the 90s to try and inform the South African bureaucrats, lessons learned from Zimbabwe and the rest of Africa. There's clearly a decline in the capacity of the state. And the points that Adam made, the need to technocratize the state, infuse the state with new appointments, better skills towards the developmental state were very important. Then the national question, shoo, with the BC laid bare. Nomboniso was poignant in the examples she gave. The extent to which the state appears to subsume community interests around behind an overarching description of the situation in the country, when these communities need particular attention, especially at the time of the pandemic. Well, it's really to thank you. I'm not sure we are able to explore sufficiently the trajectory towards a better economic and political future. The debate continues, but I think we are very honored and privileged to have had all of you as panelists and discussants, among the best. The good thing that it's all recorded, it will be transcribed, it will be published, and we will have your contributions published in different newspapers, so the debate continues. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
All right,
Thank you, Ibo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Ibo.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, colleague. Night.
Thank you.
Kaina pana mawa na kokate.